Welcome to Sleepy Philosophy. Settle in and settle down. Tonight, our topic is all about Dostoevsky. We will cover his life, his principles, and the bleak realization of what it means to be human. Before we do begin, leave a comment of the question that keeps you awake at night, as well as the time that you're watching. As always, if you enjoy, please don't forget to subscribe and leave a like. Without further ado, let's begin. Answer me this. Do you believe that true suffering has a meaning? What about if guilt truly transforms a person? If good and evil exist within every soul, what really determines the path we walk down? Dostoevsky asks these questions not in lectures, but through his everyday life. He didn't invent heroes, he just showcased people like you and me. People who were torn apart, torn between the very thought of action and consequence. He wrote of characters who truly felt real, people who were crushed by the thought of choosing good and bad, the same people who lie awake at night silently struggling with the thoughts in their head. Dostoevsky's life was not easy. He lived through poverty, he rotted in prison, and he even felt the worst pangs of loss. But out of that darkness, he wrote novels that shaped how we are known as people. Today, more than a century later, people still turn to his works to try to understand what being human means, as well as the impact of what having a soul does. This is the story of Dostoevsky, the man who gave the voice to the thoughts that keep us all awake at night. Dostoevsky was born in Moscow in 1821. His father, Mikhail, worked as a doctor at the Mariinsky Hospital for the Poor, a place where the city's destitute went to die as much to be treated. It was overcrowded, unsanitary, and filled with suffering. Living on the hospital grounds, Dostoevsky's earliest moments were not of games or gardens, but of patients coughing, funerals passing by the window, and corpses being carried through the yard. Most children were sheltered from death, but for Dostoevsky, it was an everyday scenery. His father was strict, authoritarian, and often harsh. Mikhail believed discipline was the foundation of success. At home, he ruled with severity, demanding obedience from his children and leaving little room for warmth. Family meals could feel more like interrogations than gatherings. His approach left deep marks. Years later, Dostoevsky's novels often featured cruel fathers or authority figures who crushed the people around them. His mother, Maria, was the opposite. She was gentle, devout, and patient. She introduced him to the Bible and instilled him in a sense of faith. For Dostoevsky, she represented compassion in an otherwise difficult childhood. But Maria was not destined for this world. Tuberculosis slowly consumed her, and when she died in 1837, Dostoevsky was just 15. The loss was devastating. It left him with a paradox he never really resolved. Why do the kindest people seem to suffer the most, while the harshest lived on? That contradiction between love and suffering became central to his thinking. Books filled the gaps his mother's death left. He and his brother, also Mikhail, devoured literature, Russian novels, European classics, history, and philosophy. They read obsessively, not for entertainment, but with the fact that somewhere in those pages might be an answer to the question life had forced on them too early. That same year, their father died. Officially, the cause was a stroke, but rumors spread that peasants on his estate had killed him, fed up with his cruelty. Stories circulated. Some said he was smothered, others claimed he was forced to drink until he suffocated. Whether true or not, the suspicion stuck. For a teenage Dostoevsky, the idea that his father had been murdered by his own peasants was enough to plant lifelong questions about guilt and rebellion. In the brothers Karamazov, where the tyrannical father is killed and his sons become suspects, echoes of that memory resurface. By the end of his adolescence, Dostoevsky had endured the death of his mother, the rumored murder of his father, and the constant presence of poverty and disease. These were not abstract ideas, they were lived expectations, and they shaped the questions that would dominate his work. What does suffering mean? Can faith survive tragedy? Is rebellion against cruelty justified, or does it create new guilt? His childhood was not an obstacle he overcame. It was the foundation he never escaped. The hospital, the harsh father, the devout mother, the losses, and the rumors of violence, all of it burned itself into him. When he later wrote about despair, punishment, and redemption, he wasn't inventing themes. He was replaying the first chapters of his own life. After the death of both parents, Dostoevsky and his brother Mikhail were sent to St. Petersburg to continue their education. For a boy already marked by tragedy, the city offered a different kind of intensity: harsh winters, overcrowded streets, and the cultural heart of Russia. If Moscow had shown him death and poverty, St. Petersburg would show him ambition, ideas, and the cost of pursuing them. He entered the Nikolaev Military Engineering School in 1838. The choice was practical, not personal. The family had limited money, and a military-sponsored education promised stability. Dostoevsky never had a soldier's temperament, but the school taught him discipline, mathematics, and the technical side of engineering. More importantly, it gave him access to literature and philosophy that would change his life. Evenings in the barracks became his real education. Instead of resting after drills, he read feverishly Shakespeare, Schiller, Hugo, Byron, and above all, Pushkin. Pushkin was more than a poet to Russians. He was a symbol of national identity. To Dostoevsky, he was proof that literature could capture the soul of a people. That realization shaped his ambition. He didn't just want to write, he wanted to write in a way that revealed the Russian spirit. He also discovered European philosophers. Rousseau's Confessions fascinated him. Here was a man laying bare his inner life with brutal honesty, refusing to hide his flaws or sins. It was a model Dostoevsky would later follow. Novels that exposed not just what people did, but what they thought in their darkest hours. He read Goethe, admired his scope, but also sensed that European rationalism could not fully explain the contradictions of human behavior. This tension between reason and chaos became one of his lifelong themes. Money was always tight. His father's estate had been left in disarray, and inheritance disputes kept the family unstable. At school, Dostoevsky often looked pale, exhausted, and older than his years. But classmates noticed his intensity. He had a habit of staring off in silence, then suddenly launching into conversation with a depth that made people uneasy. Even before his first book, he carried the air of someone who lived more in thought than in the world around him. Graduating in 1843, he briefly worked as an engineer. The salary paid his bills, but the profession did not suit him. He found the work sterile. He wanted to write. Nights were spent drafting stories, sketching characters, and experimenting with style. He was restless, aware that time was short and he had something urgent to say. By 1844, he made a decisive choice. He left engineering behind to pursue literature full-time. It was a risky move. Russia's literary world was small, competitive, and often subject to government censorship. But Dostoevsky believed he had to try. His first success came quickly. In 1846, he published Poor Folk, a novel written in the form of letters between two impoverished characters. It was not just a story of hardship, it was an intimate look at the dignity and despair of the poor. The book caught the attention of prominent critic Vissarion Belinsky, who hailed it as a new step for Russian literature. Overnight, Dostoevsky went from an unknown engineer to a writer with promise. For a young man who had grown up among the poor and the dying, Poor Folk was more than fiction. It was a reflection of the lives he had witnessed since childhood. Readers praised its empathy and realism. Dostoevsky had shown that literature could give voice to those society ignored. He was no longer just a reader of European literature, he was now a participant in the Russian literary movement. But success brought pressure. His next works, The Double and Nitoshka Nezvanova, were less well received. Critics accused him of being too psychological, too strange. Belinsky, once his champion, grew colder. Dostoevsky felt the sting of rejection deeply. He had tasted fame, but already he sensed how fickle it could be. In these years, he also entered the circles of intellectuals and reformers in St. Petersburg. The 1840s in Russia were a time of political ferment. Writers, students, and thinkers debated serfdom, autocracy, and social reform. Many were influenced by European socialism and utopian ideals. Dostoevsky joined discussions with groups like the Petrushevsky Circle, where radical ideas circulated. At first, he was drawn to their optimism. The possibility of a more just society appealed to him, especially after seeing the misery of the poor. But even then, he had doubts. He admired their passion, but worried about their simplicity. Could human nature really be remade by new laws or systems? Was suffering something that could be eliminated by reform, or was it something deeper? These were questions he would continue to wrestle with long after he left those circles. The turning point came in 1849, when the government cracked down on reformist groups. Dostoevsky and other members of the Petrushevsky Circle were arrested. He was accused of participating in discussions critical of the Tsar and promoting banned literature. For weeks he sat in prison, unsure of his fate. Then came the event that would mark him forever. In December of that year, He and other prisoners were led into a courtyard. They were sentenced to death by firing squad. Dostoevsky stood in line, minutes away from execution. At the last moment, a messenger arrived. The Tsar had commuted their sentences. It had all been a stage performance, designed to terrify them before sending them to Siberian exile. For Dostoevsky, those minutes before the supposed execution were transformative. Later he said that in those moments, life appeared to him with unimaginable clarity. Every detail was precious. The reprieve did not bring relief. It brought a new weight. He had been given life back, but under conditions that would test him more than ever. This marked the end of his early career in St. Petersburg. The young writer of Poor Folk, the dreamer influenced by European literature, the participant in reformist discussions, all of that ended in chains. Ahead lay prison, Siberia, and years of silence. In January 1850, Dostoevsky was sent to a prison camp in Omsk, Siberia. The journey itself was brutal. Weeks in chains, packed into sleds, exposed to the freezing winds of the Russian winter. Siberia was not just a place, it was a punishment. A deliberate exile to the farthest edge of empire, where criminals and political prisoners alike were meant to disappear. The prison he entered was overcrowded, filthy, and suffocating. Wooden barracks crammed with men, the air thick with stench, lice, and disease. He shared space with murderers, thieves, and outcasts. The guards treated them all the same, as less than human. For a man who had grown up immersed in literature, it was as if he had been dropped into a different world, one stripped of dignity, privacy, and hope. For the first months, he could barely write. Books were forbidden, paper was scarce, and guards watched closely. The silence this imposed on him was almost worse than the physical hardship. For a writer, to lose the ability to write was a second kind of imprisonment. Still, he observed. He listened. He studied the men around him. Many were hardened criminals, but Dostoevsky did not see monsters. He saw human beings, broken, yes, but carrying stories, regrets, and sometimes even kindness. He later admitted that Siberia cured him of certain illusions. He had once sympathized with utopian thinkers who believed human nature could be reshaped. But in the barracks, he saw that suffering and cruelty were not only products of society. They were deeply human traits. Men who had endured years of misery still found ways to hurt one another. And yet, in the same breath, the same men could show compassion, sharing food, or defending a weaker prisoner. It was contradiction in its rawest form. Religious faith also resurfaced during these years. Deprived of books, Dostoevsky's only reading was a copy of the New Testament, given to him by a group of women before he left St. Petersburg. He kept it hidden, returning to it constantly. For him, the Gospels were not abstract theology. They were survival. He came to believe that redemption was possible, but only through personal responsibility and suffering. This was no longer the inherited faith of his mother. It was forged in the crucible of prison. Daily life was crushing. Work gangs were forced to labor in freezing conditions, hauling bricks, digging ditches, repairing roads. Food was meager: black bread, thin cabbage soup, sometimes rotten meat. Prisoners slept on bare boards, crammed together, lice crawling through their clothes. Violence was common. Guards beat prisoners without warning. Fights erupted in the barracks. For 4 years, Dostoevsky endured this. But his mind did not shut down. Instead, he absorbed everything. The mix of despair and resilience among the prisoners fascinated him. Later novels like Notes from the House of the Dead drew directly from this experience, portraying the humanity of criminals in ways Russian literature had never attempted. He described how even in the worst conditions, men clung to small freedoms: a song hummed quietly, a joke shared, a memory of family. Exile also reshaped his views of revolution and politics. Before prison, he had believed ideas might change the world. In Siberia, he came to distrust theories that treated people as abstractions. He began to see that any ideology that ignored the depths of human suffering and contradiction was doomed to fail. It wasn't that he abandoned hope for change, but he became convinced that true reform could not be imposed from above. It had to begin with the soul of the individual. When his 4 years of hard labor ended in 1854, Dostoevsky was not free. He was transferred to serve as a soldier in a Siberian regiment. It was humiliating, a once promising writer now reduced to the lowest rank. But in comparison to prison, it was a relief. He could walk outside, breathe air without bars around him, and eventually he began to write again. Siberia nearly broke him. It also remade him. He entered as a young writer with political dreams. He left as a man marked by suffering, faith, and a profound understanding of human contradiction. If before he had written with sympathy for the poor, after Siberia he wrote with insight into the darkest corners of the human heart. The themes of crime, punishment, redemption, and the tension between cruelty and compassion. All of them were born in the barracks of Omsk. Later in life, when people asked how he endured those years, Dostoevsky rarely gave details. He didn't have to. His novels carried the memory more vividly than any confession could. When Dostoevsky finally left the prison barracks behind, he was not stepping into freedom, but into another kind of captivity, military service in Siberia. Stripped of rank, assigned as a common soldier, he lived under the watchful eyes of officers who never forgot he had been condemned as a criminal. Yet compared to Omsk, this was almost a liberation. He could see open skies, walk streets without shackles, and, most importantly, begin writing again. Exile had stripped him of youth. He was only in his early 30s, but he carried the weight of a man twice his age. His health had deteriorated. Seizures brought on by epilepsy grew worse during these years. Each attack left him exhausted, sometimes bedridden for days. But his mind, sharpened by years of deprivation, was restless. He had lost everything: reputation, career, his place in literary society, and now had to begin again from the bottom. It was during this time that he met Maria Dmitrievna Isayeva, a widow living in Siberia with her young son. Their marriage, in 1857, was complicated from the start. Dostoevsky loved passionately, but he was also plagued by jealousy, insecurity, and poverty. The relationship was strained, marked by financial troubles and frequent illness. Still, Maria represented a return to ordinary human life, a fragile but necessary step after years of isolation. Permission to publish again came slowly. The Tsarist government monitored former prisoners closely, suspicious of any attempt to re-enter intellectual life. But in 1860, Dostoevsky managed to release Notes from the House of the Dead. It was a thinly veiled account of his years in Omsk, blending memoir and fiction. Russian readers had never seen anything like it. The book was not just a record of brutality. It was a study of human beings in their most extreme conditions. Dostoevsky described fellow prisoners not as faceless criminals, but as men with stories, sorrows, and flashes of dignity. For Russian society, accustomed to thinking of convicts as subhuman, it was shocking. For Dostoevsky, it was vindication. He had turned years of suffering into art that mattered. The impact was immediate. Critics recognized it as a work of depth and originality. Readers felt the power of his witness. For the first time since Poor Folk, Dostoevsky was once again part of Russia's literary conversation. But this time, he was no longer the young writer imitating European models. He had found his voice, and it came from the darkest places he had known. Around this time, his brother Mikhail re-entered his life. Together they founded a literary journal, Vremya, meaning time, in 1861. The magazine gave Dostoevsky a platform to publish his own work and comment on the social debates of the day. Through it, he reached a growing audience eager for discussions about reform, morality, and Russia's identity in a changing world. But life outside literature was never easy. Maria's health declined, and her illness strained both finances and emotions. Dostoevsky's own health faltered as seizures grew more violent. He was also haunted by gambling, a habit that began during his travels to Europe and became a destructive compulsion. Nights at the roulette table left him in debt, humiliated, and desperate for money. These personal battles fed his fiction. The intensity of guilt, temptation, and the cycles of despair he later depicted came not from imagination, but from lived experience. Despite hardship, his writing deepened. Stories like Notes from Underground began to push Russian literature into darker, more psychological territory. He was a narrator who was bitter, self-contradictory, and at times repulsive, yet painfully human. With this short work, Dostoevsky announced himself as something more than a novelist of poverty or prison life. He was becoming a philosopher of the human soul. By the early 1860s, the shadows of exile were behind him, but their mark was permanent. The man who had once been sentenced to death now lived as if every moment mattered, yet also as if every moment carried the weight of judgment. He had returned from Siberia, but Siberia had not left him. By the mid-1860s, Dostoevsky was standing at a crossroads. He was back in print, back in discussion, but still trapped in financial ruin. Debts from gambling weighed heavily. Maria's illness drained resources and emotional strength. Publishers hounded him for manuscripts. He was living on the edge, sometimes pawning his clothes or furniture just to eat. It was in this desperate state that he produced the novel that would define him, Crime and Punishment. Published in 1866, it was not just another Russian novel. It was a plunge into the psyche of a murderer, exploring not only the crime itself, but the grinding torment that followed. Its protagonist, Raskolnikov, kills a pawnbroker with a theory in mind, that extraordinary men have the right to step over moral laws for the sake of higher goals. But instead of liberation, the act brings crushing guilt, paranoia, and collapse. The novel was revolutionary for its psychological depth. Rather than presenting crime as a matter of police and punishment, Dostoevsky portrayed it as an existential catastrophe. The true punishment was not prison, but the endless churn of a guilty conscience. In Russia, where debates about reform, morality, and justice were at a fever pitch, the book struck like lightning. Readers recognized themselves in Raskolnikov's rationalizations and his subsequent torment. Critics saw in it the birth of psychological realism, a literature that did not just describe actions but dissected the soul. The impact was immediate. Dostoevsky, once forgotten in exile, was suddenly one of Russia's central voices again. Yet success did not free him from his own demons. Gambling debts mounted, creditors threatened, and Maria's health deteriorated further. Under immense pressure, he signed a brutal contract with a publisher in 1865. If he failed to deliver a novel by November of the following year, he would lose the rights to all his future works for 9 years. It was a trap that could have destroyed him. To meet the deadline, Dostoevsky turned to a new strategy, dictation. He hired a young stenographer, Anna Grigorievna Snikina. She was efficient, disciplined, and intelligent, everything he was not. Working together under immense time pressure, they completed The Gambler in just 26 days. The novel was thinly disguised autobiography, a man obsessed with roulette, destroyed by debt, endlessly pulled back to the gaming table despite the knowledge it would ruin him. Anna was more than a stenographer. She became his partner, and in 1867, his second wife. With her, Dostoevsky found stability he had never known. She managed his finances, curbed his gambling, and provided steady support during his epileptic fits and creative storms. Their marriage did not eliminate his struggles, but it gave him the grounding to endure them. Even with Anna at his side, life remained precarious. Debts drove the couple abroad for several years, where Dostoevsky haunted the casinos of Germany and Switzerland, winning and losing fortunes in a single night. At the same time, he was working on his next masterpiece, one that would probe even deeper into the chaos of human motives, The Idiot. But crime and punishment had already established the template for everything that followed. Dostoevsky had found his subject, not simply society, not simply politics, but the contradictions of human nature itself. He saw in every person the capacity for cruelty and compassion, rebellion and repentance. And he wrote not as a detached observer, but as someone who had lived those contradictions. From this point forward, Russian literature would not be the same. Dostoevsky was no longer the young man imitating European trends. He had become something singular, a writer who treated the human conscience as his stage, guilt as his protagonist, and redemption as his impossible goal. After the triumph of crime and punishment, Dostoevsky faced the impossible task of writing something equally powerful. His debts, however, left him no choice. He and Anna fled Russia in 1867, chased by creditors, and spent 4 years moving through Europe, Germany, Switzerland, Italy. On paper, these years should have been fruitful: freedom from the authorities, new surroundings, access to European culture. In reality, they were dominated by poverty, illness, and gambling. Casinos became a recurring trap. In Baden-Baden, Wiesbaden, and Hamburg, Dostoevsky risked everything at the roulette wheel. Anna watched him lose the money for their rent, their food, even the clothes on his back. She once recalled pawning her wedding dress to cover a debt. Dostoevsky wrote frantically to pay bills, then squandered earnings within days. It was a vicious cycle that seemed endless, yet amid this instability, he produced The Idiot, 1869. Its central figure, Prince Myshkin, was conceived as a positively good man, a Christ-like figure placed within the corruption of modern society. Myshkin's innocence, however, is not rewarded, is ridiculed, manipulated, and destroyed by the very world he tries to redeem. The novel explored the collision between purity and cruelty, faith and cynicism. Critics were divided. Some admired its ambition, others found it chaotic and overly emotional. But readers sensed its urgency. Dostoevsky was not writing abstract philosophy. He was wrestling, on the page, with his own questions about whether goodness could survive in a world dominated by selfishness, power, and desire. His own life mirrored these contradictions. While writing The Idiot, he and Anna lived in Geneva, where their first daughter, Sophia, was born. She died just 3 months later, a loss that devastated them both. Grief pressed heavily on their already fragile existence. Dostoevsky's seizures grew worse, triggered by stress and exhaustion. Anna, though only in her early 20s, became caretaker, financial manager, and emotional anchor for her volatile husband. During these years abroad, Dostoevsky also worked on Demons, sometimes translated as The Possessed, a searing critique of radical politics and revolutionary nihilism. Inspired by real events in Russia, particularly the murder of a student by a revolutionary cell, the novel portrayed how abstract ideology could descend into violence and madness. To Dostoevsky, this was not fiction but prophecy. He feared Russia was headed for chaos if ideas were allowed to eclipse humanity. By the time Demons appeared in 1872, Dostoevsky's reputation in Russia had solidified. He was no longer merely a novelist, he was becoming a moral commentator, a voice wrestling with the deepest crises of his age. Even as his personal life lurched between despair and recovery, his fiction grew more prophetic, warning of forces that would shape Russia's future. Eventually, the family returned to Russia in 1871, exhausted from years of instability. They settled in St. Petersburg, determined to rebuild. Anna managed their finances with strict discipline, ensuring that roulette no longer consumed them. Dostoevsky, at last, could focus on writing without the constant fear of creditors at the door. But the scars of exile, poverty, and loss remained. His novels carried them forward, blending confession, prophecy, and philosophical exploration. He was no longer writing to survive a deadline. He was writing to make sense of the human condition itself. By the early 1870s, Dostoevsky had fully returned to Russia. He was older now, worn down by epilepsy, financial struggles, and the trauma of exile, but his reputation was greater than ever. The years abroad had given him distance from Russian society, and that distance sharpened his vision. When he looked back home, what he saw disturbed him deeply. The Russia he returned to was not the one he had left. Serfdom had been abolished in 1861, bringing vast social upheaval. Young intellectuals embraced radical ideologies from Europe, socialism, atheism, revolutionary conspiracies. Secret groups plotted against the Tsar, convinced that violence was the only way forward. To Dostoevsky, who had once flirted with radical thought and suffered exile for it, the trend was ominous. He knew firsthand where reckless ideas could lead. Out of this climate emerged Demons, 1872. The novel was more than a story. It was a diagnosis of Russia's spiritual sickness. At its core was the tale of a provincial town infiltrated by a group of revolutionaries who, driven by abstract theories, descend into chaos and murder. The characters were not caricatures but complex figures, ambitious, nihilistic, self-destructive. Each one embodied an extreme that Dostoevsky believed could tear Russia apart. The novel's central message was stark: when ideology replaces morality, when abstract theories are valued above human life, society becomes possessed by destructive forces. In this sense, the demons were not supernatural beings, but ideas themselves, ideas that could hollow out souls and unleash violence. Readers recognized the parallels immediately. The real-life case of Sergei Nechayev, a radical who orchestrated the murder of a fellow student in 1869, had shocked the nation. Dostoevsky seized on this event, weaving it into his fiction as a warning of where unchecked nihilism might lead. Many critics condemned the novel as overly political, even hysterical, but others saw it as prophetic. In the decades after Dostoevsky's death, when revolution swept Russia, Demons seemed less like fiction and more like foresight. Writing Demons was not easy. It was long, sprawling, and bitter, filled with dark satire. Some readers recoiled from its brutality. But Dostoevsky was not writing to comfort. He wanted to expose what he saw as the destructive undercurrents of modern Russia. The laughter in the novel was sharp and cruel, the violence unsettling. For him, this was not exaggeration, but truth. Amid this grim work, Dostoevsky's personal life showed glimmers of stability. With Anna managing household finances, the family finally avoided total ruin. Their second daughter, Lyubov, was born in 1869, though their relationship with her would later be troubled. Anna's discipline allowed Dostoevsky to focus on his writing rather than gambling or creditors. For perhaps the first time in decades, his household had something resembling order. Still, peace was fragile. His health continued to fail. Seizures struck unpredictably, leaving him weak and disoriented. He lived with the constant knowledge that death might come suddenly, in sleep or on the street. This awareness infused his writing with urgency. Every book felt like it might be his last. Demons was not universally loved, but it cemented his reputation as Russia's most fearless novelist. He was not merely telling stories, but confronting the moral and spiritual crises of his nation. The novel was a warning. If Russia surrendered itself to ideology, it would be consumed by forces it could not control. For Dostoevsky, these were not abstract musings. They were personal. He had lived through the extremes of belief and punishment, and now he was determined to testify to their dangers. Demons was his testimony. Bitter, scathing, prophetic. By the mid-1870s, Dostoevsky's writing was no longer just literature. It had become confession. After Demons, his role as a novelist blurred into that of a prophet, a moralist, a spiritual witness. He was not simply recording the times, he was interpreting them. And at the center of this interpretation stood his growing return to faith. This return had roots in his earliest years, but exile and suffering had transformed it into something more personal. In prison, he had read the New Testament obsessively, the one book allowed to convicts. It stayed with him for life. Now, decades later, that memory shaped his worldview. Dostoevsky was not naive about religion. He had seen hypocrisy in the church, doubt in the intellectual classes, and cruelty among believers. But he clung to faith not as an institution, but as a lifeline, the only possible answer to despair. This conviction permeated his later works. He saw faith not as a set of doctrines, but as a question of the heart. Could humanity live without God? Could morality exist if the divine was abandoned? For him, the answer was no. Without belief, he feared, the world would collapse into violence and nihilism. It was in this spirit that he wrote The Diary of a Writer, a series of essays and reflections published regularly from 1873 onward. Unlike his novels, these writings address contemporary issues directly: politics, social change, crime, education, and Russia's destiny. They reveal Dostoevsky not only as a novelist, but as a public intellectual. He was opinionated, sometimes reactionary, but always unflinchingly honest. His readers either revered him or despised him, but no one could ignore him. One recurring theme of the diary was Russia's unique spiritual role. He believed Russia had a destiny apart from the rationalism of the West. While Europe pursued science, secularism, and individualism, Dostoevsky envisioned Russia as a spiritual guide for the world, rooted in Orthodox Christianity and communal values. It was a sweeping, often romantic vision, but it gave his writing an intensity unmatched by his contemporaries. Critics accused him of nationalism, and in truth, his views could be narrow. Yet behind his rhetoric was a profound concern: what would happen to a society that lost faith entirely? He saw Europe already heading in that direction, and he feared Russia would follow. His solution was not politics, but a revival of the human spirit. Personally, this period was bittersweet. Anna gave birth to more children, though not all survived infancy. Their son Fyodor, born in 1871, became a particular source of joy. Domestic life in St. Petersburg brought him a stability that once seemed impossible. Yet his health remained fragile, his seizures more frequent, and money still a constant worry. Even so, Dostoevsky's voice grew louder. By the late 1870s, he was no longer merely a writer in debt. He was a figure of national importance. People turned to him not just for stories, but for answers to the crises of modern life. Whether or not they agreed with him, they recognized his courage in facing questions most would avoid. Faith, for Dostoevsky, was never simple optimism. It was born from the recognition of darkness. He believed the human soul contained both the highest potential and the deepest abyss, and only through faith could one confront both without despair. This conviction would reach its peak in his final and greatest work, a novel that brought all his themes together into one grand vision: the brothers Karamazov. By the late 1870s, Dostoevsky was approaching the end of his life, though he could not have known how little time remained. His health was failing, seizures more frequent, and years of stress had left his body weakened. Yet out of this fragility came the most ambitious and comprehensive novel of his career, The Brothers Karamazov, published in 1880. The novel was not just a story of a family, but a vast philosophical drama. At its center was the murder of a cruel and debased patriarch, Fyodor Karamazov, and the fate of his sons. Each brother represented a different spiritual and intellectual path. Dmitri, the passionate essentialist, lived for desire and impulse. Ivan, the intellectual skeptic, embodied reason and doubt, famously declaring, "If God does not exist, everything is permitted." Alyosha, the gentle novice, represented faith, humility, and the possibility of spiritual renewal. The novel explored the tensions between these paths with unflinching depth. Ivan's dialogue with the figure of the devil, his famous story of the Grand Inquisitor, and his haunting rejection of a world built on innocent suffering remain some of the most powerful passages in world literature. Alyosha, meanwhile, offered a vision of grace and redemption, not through triumph, but through humility and love. Unlike his earlier works, The Brothers Karamazov was expansive, weaving together crime, family drama, theology, and philosophy, yet it was never detached. It pulsed with urgency, as though Dostoevsky was pouring his entire life's thought into one book. Many of the novel's themes were familiar from his earlier works: the struggle between belief and doubt, the nature of evil, the weight of suffering. But here they reached their fullest expression. Dostoevsky intended The Brothers Karamazov to be only the beginning. He spoke of writing a sequel that would follow Alyosha into adulthood, continuing his spiritual journey and confronting new crises. Death, however, intervened before he could begin. As it stands, the novel remains both complete and unfinished, a summation of his vision and a promise of more that never came. The reception of the book was extraordinary. Readers recognized it as the culmination of his career. Critics debated its meaning, but few denied its power. Even those who disliked his politics or religious convictions admitted that he had captured something essential about the human condition. The novel resonated far beyond Russia. Later thinkers, Freud, Einstein, Nietzsche, Camus, and countless others, would wrestle with the questions Dostoevsky raised in its pages. Behind the novel's grandeur was personal urgency. Dostoevsky knew he was running out of time. Writing under failing health, he poured everything into the brothers Karamazov, perhaps sensing it would be his final testament. When he completed it, he told Anna that he had at last said all he needed to say. For readers, the novel offered no easy answers. It did not resolve the struggle between faith and doubt, love and cruelty, freedom and responsibility. Instead, it dramatized those conflicts, showing them alive within characters who felt as real as the people outside the reader's door. That, perhaps, was Dostoevsky's greatest gift, to make the abstract visceral, to make philosophy bleed. In The Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky gave his final word on the human condition, that we are torn between the sacred and the profane, destined to struggle, yet always capable of grace. By 1880, Dostoevsky was widely regarded as Russia's greatest living novelist. The publication of The Brothers Karamazov had sealed his reputation, and for the first time in decades, he was no longer drowning in poverty. His lectures and public readings drew enormous crowds. His name was on the lips of students and intellectuals, and even those who disliked his worldview acknowledged his power. Yet beneath this recognition, his health was collapsing. For years he had lived with epilepsy, but in his final decade, the seizures came with greater violence and frequency. Anna watched him carefully, managing his life with discipline and care, but there was little she could do to shield him from the strain. The act of writing, which gave him purpose, also drained his remaining strength. Nights spent at his desk, racked by coughing and pain, were followed by mornings of weakness. Still, he persisted. In June of 1880, Dostoevsky traveled to Moscow to deliver the keynote address at the unveiling of a monument to Alexander Pushkin, Russia's great poet. The moment was symbolic. The once condemned political prisoner was now being honored alongside the nation's literary giants. His speech was electric. Rather than praising Pushkin alone, Dostoevsky spoke of Russia's spiritual destiny, of the need for unity, of the possibility of a universal harmony rooted in Christian humility. The audience erupted. Many wept openly. To some, it felt like prophecy. For Dostoevsky, it was a moment of vindication. His voice, once silenced by chains, was now guiding the nation's imagination. But triumph was short-lived. Within months, his health declined sharply. Tuberculosis spread in his lungs and throat, weakening him further. He was often bedridden, coughing blood, unable to work for long stretches. Yet even then, his mind burned with plans. He spoke of continuing the story of Alyosha Karamazov, of exploring how faith could survive in a world of modern doubt. Death, however, moved faster. On January 28, 1881, Dostoevsky suffered a massive pulmonary hemorrhage. Anna recorded that he seemed calm, almost resigned, as though he had long anticipated this end. He asked for the family to gather, and in his final hours he read aloud from the Gospel of Matthew, the parable of the prodigal son. To him, it encapsulated everything: sin, suffering, return, and redemption. The following day, he died at the age of 59. His funeral in St. Petersburg drew an astonishing crowd. Tens of thousands followed the procession, from students and radicals to priests and soldiers. It was not merely a funeral, it was a national event. People argued about his ideas, his politics, his faith, but all agreed on his significance. In a society torn between tradition and revolution, he had forced Russians to confront themselves. In death, Dostoevsky's legacy only grew. His works became central not only to Russian culture, but to world literature. Thinkers from Freud to Nietzsche, from Sartre to Camus, found in him a mirror for their own obsessions, freedom, morality, suffering, and the terrifying possibility that life might lack inherent meaning. What Dostoevsky offered was not resolution but confrontation, the demand that one face the abyss honestly. The final years of his life were marked by paradox, recognition and decline, triumph and death. Yet perhaps that was fitting. For Dostoevsky, greatness was never separate from suffering. His end was not peaceful, but it was purposeful. He died having fulfilled his vow to speak the truth of the human soul, no matter how dark or unbearable. When Dostoevsky died in January 1881, Russia stood at a crossroads. The assassination of Tsar Alexander I came just weeks later, plunging the country into another wave of repression and unrest. In that climate, Dostoevsky's voice seemed even more prophetic. He had warned of chaos if Russia abandoned its spiritual roots, and now, to many, his warnings appeared vindicated. The immediate response to his death was unlike anything seen for a writer in Russia. More than 30 people followed his funeral procession through St. Petersburg, a staggering number for the time. Students carried banners with passages from his novels. Workers, clergy, intellectuals, and even political exiles gathered side by side. It was not only a tribute, but a declaration. His words had transcended literature to become part of the Russian conscience. What made his legacy so powerful was its complexity. Dostoevsky did not fit neatly into any camp. Conservatives claimed him as a defender of faith and tradition, while radicals admired his raw depictions of oppression and injustice. Believers saw in him a prophet of Christian truth, while atheists found in his explorations of doubt and rebellion a voice for their own struggles. He belonged to everyone and no one. In the years immediately after his death, his novels became central to Russian intellectual life. Young readers debated his characters as though they were real people. Was Ivan right that morality collapses without God? Was Raskolnikov justified in his rebellion against society? Could Alyosha's humility really redeem anything? These questions echoed in classrooms, salons, and political gatherings. Dostoevsky's fiction had become philosophy by another name. Outside Russia, translation spread slowly at first, but grew in influence by the late 19th century. In Germany, Nietzsche read him with awe, calling him the only psychologist from whom I had something to learn. In France, novelists admired his psychological depth. In Britain, critics compared him to Shakespeare for his ability to reveal the extremes of human nature. His reach expanded steadily, carried by readers who sensed in his work an honesty missing in much of modern literature. Yet Dostoevsky's legacy was not only literary. His exploration of morality, guilt, and redemption influenced psychology, theology, and even political thought. Sigmund Freud later remarked that the brothers Karamazov contained the most penetrating analysis of patricide ever written. Existentialist philosophers like Sartre and Camus saw him as a forerunner of their movement, though they rejected his embrace of faith. He became a touchstone for anyone wrestling with questions of freedom, responsibility, and despair. For Russia itself, his role became even more contested. In the late 19th century, he was celebrated as a national treasure. By the early 20th century, as revolution loomed, radicals pointed to his warnings about nihilism and violence. After the Bolshevik Revolution, the Soviet regime had an uneasy relationship with him. His religious themes were officially suspect, but his psychological insight and critiques of oppression could not be dismissed. For decades, he was alternately celebrated, censored, and cautiously tolerated. But whatever the political shifts, his reputation only grew outside the reach of ideology. His characters had a universality that no regime could erase. Readers in every country recognized themselves in his portraits of doubt, guilt, pride, and longing. Dostoevsky had exposed something that crossed borders, the inner contradictions of being human. In death, as in life, he refused to be contained. His legacy was not a monument, but a mirror, and every generation would see something different in it. In the decades following Dostoevsky's death, European philosophy underwent a transformation. Questions of faith, morality, and the meaning of existence came to the forefront, and Dostoevsky's novels became a hidden engine in that movement. Though he never called himself a philosopher, his explorations of freedom, despair, and responsibility made him a forerunner of what would later be called existentialism. Central to existentialism is the problem of freedom, the terrifying realization that human beings are not bound by divine law or absolute morality, and that each person must decide how to live. Dostoevsky confronted this head-on. In Notes from Underground, his bitter anti-hero mocks rational systems of progress, and insists that man will act against his own interests simply to prove he is free. That insight, that freedom can be destructive as well as liberating, would become a cornerstone of existential thought. Friedrich Nietzsche, writing in Germany during the same period, recognized a kindred spirit. Though Nietzsche rejected Christianity, he admired Dostoevsky's psychological depth. He once wrote that Dostoevsky was the only psychologist from whom I had something to learn. Nietzsche's concept of the will to power and his stark confrontation with nihilism ran parallel to Dostoevsky's explorations of rebellion, suffering, and the collapse of certainty. Where Nietzsche proclaimed the death of God, Dostoevsky dramatized the consequences of living in a world where that death seemed inevitable. In the 20th century, French thinkers carried Dostoevsky's influence further. Jean-Paul Sartre admired his depiction of freedom's burden. For Sartre, characters like Raskolnikov embodied the existential crisis, the attempt to live beyond morality, only to discover that freedom itself becomes unbearable. Albert Camus, meanwhile, saw Dostoevsky as both ally and adversary. Camus praised the unflinching honesty of the brothers Karamazov, but rejected Dostoevsky's turn to faith as a resolution. In Camus' view, the abyss must be faced without appeal to God. Beyond philosophy, Dostoevsky shaped psychology. Sigmund Freud analyzed the brothers Karamazov for its exploration of patricide and guilt, themes he believed central to the human psyche. Freud even argued that Dostoevsky's epilepsy was partly psychosomatic, a manifestation of his unresolved conflicts with his father. Later psychologists disagreed, but the fact that Freud turned to a novelist for insight showed how deeply Dostoevsky's work blurred the line between art and psychology. What set Dostoevsky apart was his refusal to simplify. He did not merely diagnose nihilism, he embodied it in characters whose contradictions felt alive. Ivan Karamazov's rebellion against God, his refusal to accept a universe built on innocent suffering, is one of the clearest statements of existential despair in literature. Yet Ivan's breakdown, haunted by madness and hallucination, suggested that despair without faith collapses into self-destruction. Dostoevsky's work became a battlefield. Philosophers could admire his clarity while rejecting his conclusions. The existentialists saw in Dostoevsky what they most needed, a writer who made abstract philosophy bleed. He turned questions of freedom, meaning, and morality into lived drama, embodied in people who could walk off the page. That power made his novels central to 20th century thought, shaping both those who embraced his religious vision and those who fought against it. Existentialism, as a movement, may not have existed without him. He gave it characters who struggled, fell, rebelled, and sometimes redeemed themselves, not through ideas alone, but through lived torment. In that sense, Dostoevsky was not only a novelist of Russia, but a prophet of modern humanity. While philosophers debated his role in existentialism, another field found in Dostoevsky a wellspring of insight, psychology. Long before modern psychiatry and psychoanalysis took shape, he was dramatizing the conflicts of the unconscious, guilt, repression, and the hidden drives of human behavior. In his essay on the brothers Karamazov, Freud called Dostoevsky's exploration of patricide the most magnificent novel ever written. For Freud, the murder of the father in that novel was not only a crime within the story, but a window into universal psychic conflict. The Oedipus complex, the ambivalence children feel toward their parents, the desire to overthrow authority mixed with deep guilt. Freud even speculated that Dostoevsky's epilepsy was psychosomatic, a bodily expression of repressed hostility toward his own father. That interpretation has been challenged, but it demonstrates how Dostoevsky forced Freud to think about literature as psychology. Carl Jung, too, saw in Dostoevsky a profound analyst of archetypes. For Jung, characters like Raskolnikov or Ivan Karamazov revealed the shadow, the dark, unconscious aspects of the self that the conscious mind refuses to acknowledge. Dostoevsky's fascination with dreams, visions, and irrational impulses resonated with Jung's belief that the psyche is shaped as much by myth and symbol as by reason. In his characters' hallucinations and fevered confessions, Jung saw the workings of archetypal patterns. Later psychologists expanded this line of thought. Dostoevsky's underground man, who rails against rationality while destroying himself with spite, has been interpreted as an early portrait of pathological narcissism. His detailed depictions of compulsion, obsession, and moral paralysis foreshadowed clinical descriptions of neurosis. The compulsive gambling episodes in The Gambler provided raw material for understanding addiction decades before the term was widely studied. In every case, his art anticipated categories that psychology would later formalize. But what made Dostoevsky especially important was his refusal to pathologize his characters into abstractions. He did not reduce them to symptoms. Instead, he gave them full humanity, even at their darkest. For him, guilt was not simply neurosis. It was a moral and spiritual wound. Madness was not only imbalance, it was the collapse of meaning. This depth made his novels useful to psychologists but resistant to reduction. In the 20th century, as psychology moved into popular culture, Dostoevsky's work found a new audience among therapists and patients alike. His novels were read as explorations of trauma, of the need for confession, of the destructive cycles of repression and release. Modern cognitive therapists, though working from very different frameworks, have noted how Dostoevsky grasped the destructive power of rumination, the way the mind circles endlessly around guilt, pride, and despair. More than anything, his psychology was relational. His characters reveal themselves in dialogue, in confrontation, in confession to others. Dostoevsky seemed to anticipate the therapeutic process itself, healing not through isolation, but through encounter, through being seen and understood even in one's darkest moments. This is why Freud, Jung, and countless others returned to him. He showed that the human mind is not a clean mechanism, but a battlefield, where freedom, compulsion, love, and hate collide. Psychology could analyze this battlefield in clinical terms, but Dostoevsky made readers feel it. His novel became, in effect, laboratories of the soul. To understand Dostoevsky without religion is almost impossible. Even when his characters doubt, blaspheme, or descend into nihilism, their struggles are set against the possibility of faith. For Dostoevsky, belief was not a quiet certainty, but a battlefield where every soul had to fight. His orthodox Christianity was not abstract theology, but lived conviction, sharpened by suffering. His years in prison convinced him that salvation could only be found in humility and love, not in progress, not in ideology, not in reason alone. He saw fate as a confrontation with the darkest corners of the human condition, not an escape from them. In Notes from Underground, The underground man rejects rational utopias precisely because they cannot account for sin. In Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov discovers that punishment is not the loss of freedom, but the absence of redemption, and only confession and suffering open the path to healing. Perhaps the clearest picture of Dostoevsky's religious vision comes in the brothers Karamazov. Through the elder Zosima and the gentle Alyosha, he presents a Christianity rooted not in power, but in compassion. Everyone is responsible to all for all, Zosima teaches, insisting that true faith begins in radical empathy. Against this vision, Ivan Karamazov voices rebellion. How can one accept a universe where children suffer? Dostoevsky did not silence that protest. Instead, he placed it at the very heart of his novel, making faith itself inseparable from the confrontation with suffering. His religion was always entwined with his nationalism. He believed that Russia's destiny was spiritual, not merely political, and that only orthodoxy could save a society fractured by materialism and revolution. For some, this conviction has made him appear reactionary. Yet his vision was less about politics than about the soul of a people. He feared that Western rationalism and socialism would leave individuals adrift, stripped of meaning, while only faith could provide an anchor. The paradox is that Dostoevsky's faith never erased doubt. His characters do not live in simple belief. They wrestle, resist, collapse, and rise again. Faith for him was not certainty but struggle. To believe was to walk through darkness with open eyes. That tension between hope and despair, redemption and ruin, gave his novels their enduring power. His religious vision also extended beyond Russia. In the 20th century, Christian existentialists such as Nikolai Berdyaev and later theologians like Paul Tillich saw in Dostoevsky a prophet of modern faith. He showed how belief must be tested against suffering and doubt, not sheltered from them. Even secular readers found in his spiritual vision a kind of honesty. If one was to reject faith, it should be rejected after wrestling with its deepest claims, not dismissed lightly. In this way, Dostoevsky gave voice to one of the oldest human struggles, how to reconcile freedom with morality, suffering with love, despair with hope. His answer, forged in Siberian exile and lived through every page of his novels, was that only faith, not abstract, but embodied in love and sacrifice, could hold the human soul together. Dostoevsky's politics were as turbulent and contradictory as his novels. He lived through an age of revolution and reaction, of socialist dreams and autocratic crackdowns. His own life, from youthful radicalism to conservative nationalism, reflected those storms. Yet beneath the shifts lay a consistent concern. What happens to human freedom and dignity when society is remade by ideology? In his youth, Dostoevsky gravitated toward radical thought. The Petrushevsky Circle, with its discussions of socialism and utopian reform, seemed to him a way to cure Russia's poverty and oppression. His arrest and mock execution shattered those illusions, and Siberian prison destroyed whatever faith he had in abstract systems. He came to see socialism not as liberation but as a form of tyranny, reducing the human soul to mere economics. This change defined his later politics. He distrusted revolutions and intellectual programs that promised salvation through reason alone. In Demons, his satire of nihilist conspirators, he depicted political radicals as consumed not by compassion but by lust for destruction. For Dostoevsky, the greatest danger of ideology was not failure but success. If rational utopias were ever realized, they would strip away freedom and individuality, turning people into obedient machines. At the same time, he was no simple defender of the status quo. He condemned the cruelty of serfdom, the arrogance of aristocracy, and the spiritual emptiness of Western materialism. He believed Russia had a special destiny, not to imitate the West, but to lead the world through its orthodox faith and communal spirit. His political writings often blended nationalism with theology, arguing that Russia's greatness lay not in conquest, but in its ability to preserve spiritual truth. Critics have accused Dostoevsky of reactionary tendencies, and it is true that his nationalism sometimes veered into xenophobia and suspicion of the West. Yet his politics were not reducible to chauvinism. He did not simply defend the autocracy, he feared the corruption of both rulers and rebels. He understood politics as a reflection of deeper moral and spiritual questions. Without faith and responsibility, neither socialism nor monarchy could save society. In this sense, Dostoevsky was not a politician, but a prophet. He warned that the attempt to build heaven on earth would unleash new forms of hell. He saw that the denial of God in the name of progress could lead not to liberation, but to despair and violence. These insights, sharpened in the 19th century, proved hauntingly relevant in the 20th, as revolutions across Russia and Europe gave rise to dictatorships that justified cruelty in the name of ideology. Dostoevsky's politics remain uncomfortable today. He cannot be claimed neatly by either left or right. He distrusted liberalism and socialism alike, while defending human dignity through faith. He believed in Russia's destiny, yet warned against pride and cruelty. His politics, like his novels, were riddled with paradox, but always rooted in the same conviction that society without spiritual grounding collapses into chaos or tyranny. Dostoevsky's influence does not rest only on what he said, but on how he wrote. His style was not polished or restrained. It was urgent, chaotic, overflowing with contradiction. Readers sometimes described his novels as unruly, but that unruliness was the point. His writing carried the pulse of life itself. One of the most striking features of his method was his use of polyphony, a term later popularized by the literary theorist Mikhail Bakhtin. Unlike writers who present a single authoritative voice, Dostoevsky filled his novels with competing voices, each demanding to be heard. Characters argue, interrupt, contradict, and undercut one another. There is no omniscient narrator who silences them with easy answers. Instead, the truth emerges, if at all, from the clash of perspectives. This gave his novels a strange vitality. They were not carefully staged arguments, but arenas of combat, where ideas fought for survival. Raskolnikov's justifications in crime and punishment do not read like straw men set up to be destroyed. They are compelling in their own right, and the reader feels their pull. Ivan Karamazov's rebellion against God is not dismissed as folly, but given such power that it shakes the foundations of faith itself. Dostoevsky's genius was to let every voice sound as though it might be right, even when he believed it was wrong. His style was also marked by intensity. He wrote with the urgency of a man racing against time, and in truth, he often was. Debts, deadlines, and illness forced him to dictate or scribble with desperate speed. This pressure left its mark, sudden shifts in tone, sprawling digressions, sentences that tumble forward breathlessly. Where other authors pruned and polished, Dostoevsky let the chaos remain. That chaos gave his work an immediacy, as though the reader is not reading a finished artifact, but overhearing a living conversation. His characters speak, not just to one another, but to the reader, to themselves, to God. A single conversation might swell into a philosophical debate, or collapse into an emotional breakdown. In these moments, Dostoevsky's novels feel less like fiction than transcripts of human souls laid bare. Equally important was his fascination with the extreme. He did not write about ordinary lives in quiet detail. He sought out crises, breakdowns, and turning points where a person's entire being is tested. Gambling, murder, confession, madness. These were not mere plot devices, but gateways to the deepest truths. He believed that only in extremity could the human spirit be revealed. Yet beneath the frenzy, there was method. Dostoevsky knew how to pace revelation, how to build tension, how to circle back to a theme until it broke open. He might seem chaotic, but he was a master of suspense. His serialized novels kept readers waiting, unable to rest until the next installment arrived. This mixture of polyphony, intensity, dialogue, and extremity made his novels feel alive in a way few others did. They resist closure, resist tidy lessons. They leave the reader unsettled, not because they fail, but because they succeed in mirroring the unsettled nature of human existence itself. During his lifetime, Dostoevsky was both admired and dismissed. Russian critics and readers struggled to place him. His early work, such as Poor Folk, earned praise for its sympathy toward the downtrodden, leading some to believe he might become a champion of the literary naturalism that defined much of mid-19th century Russian prose. But Dostoevsky quickly departed from that path. His novels did not merely describe poverty or injustice. They tore into questions of freedom, sin, faith, and despair. For readers who wanted realism without metaphysics, he was unsettling. His imprisonment and exile altered public opinion. Some saw him as a redeemed man, returned from Siberia with deeper wisdom. Others suspected he had betrayed his youthful ideals, becoming too close to the conservative establishment. This division followed him for decades. To radicals, he was an apostate who abandoned the cause of reform. To conservatives, he was a dangerous voice who still flirted with nihilism. Dostoevsky managed to offend both camps while insisting that he sought something beyond politics, the spiritual destiny of the human being. When Notes from Underground appeared in 1864, the reaction was shock more than admiration. The voice of the underground man seemed too bitter, too corrosive, too strange. Some dismissed it as incoherent ranting. Yet younger intellectuals felt the sting of recognition. It captured a new kind of consciousness, fragmented and self-aware to the point of paralysis. It was not comfortable reading, but it could not be ignored. The publication of Crime and Punishment in 1866 brought him wider fame. Serialized in The Russian Messenger, it gripped audiences week by week. Readers debated Raskolnikov's motives, his philosophy, and the possibility of his redemption. Critics still complained of melodrama and disorder, but the novel's psychological depth was undeniable. For many, Dostoevsky ceased to be a curiosity and became a force. His subsequent works deepened this reputation. The Idiot puzzled some with its saintly hero, Prince Myshkin, but others saw it as a daring attempt to depict pure goodness in a corrupt world. Demons drew fierce responses. Radicals hated its portrayal of revolutionary conspirators, while conservatives found it too sympathetic to them. By the time of the brothers Karamazov in 1880, however, his place in Russian letters was secure. The novel's exploration of morality, freedom, and faith struck a chord far beyond literary circles. The reaction to his death in 1881 confirmed his stature. Crowds filled the streets of St. Petersburg for his funeral, with thousands of mourners following the procession. His grave at the Alexander Nevsky Monastery became a site of pilgrimage, marked by an epitaph from the Gospel of John: "Except a corn of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abideth alone. But if it die, it bringeth forth much fruit." Even in the years immediately after his death, his reputation continued to grow. Russian intellectual life could no longer ignore him. Whether one agreed with his vision or resisted it, Dostoevsky had established himself as a voice no reader of the Russian soul could escape. After his death in 1881, Dostoevsky's reputation did not remain confined to Russia. His novels began to travel across borders, first through translations into French and German, then into English and other languages. What made his reception abroad remarkable was that foreign readers often recognized in him something their own literatures had not yet captured: the raw exposure of the human soul in crisis. In France, he was introduced in the late 19th century by critics like Eugène Melchior de Vogue, who placed him alongside Tolstoy and Turgenev as one of Russia's great novelists. But while Tolstoy seemed to embody moral clarity and sweeping realism, Dostoevsky struck French audiences as darker and more psychological. Writers of the symbolist movement, fascinated by mysticism and decadence, found in him a model of inner turmoil and spiritual depth. Friedrich Nietzsche, who died only a couple of decades after Dostoevsky, declared him the only psychologist from whom I had anything to learn. For Nietzsche, Dostoevsky revealed the dangerous truths beneath morality, freedom, and suffering, themes that resonated with his own explorations of nihilism. Later, German thinkers such as Thomas Mann and Hermann Hesse would weave Dostoevskian struggles into their own works, seeing in him both a warning and a guide. In the English-speaking world, Dostoevsky reached prominence a little more slowly. Early translations often softened his roughness, taming the intensity of his prose. Still, by the early 20th century, readers in Britain and America began to recognize his uniqueness. Writers like Virginia Woolf and D.H. Lawrence admired his psychological depth, while novelists such as William Faulkner drew inspiration from his layered narratives and moral ambiguity. His influence seeped into modernism, helping shape literature that broke away from neat resolutions. The 20th century expanded his reach even further. In existentialist circles, Dostoevsky became almost a patron saint. Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus saw in him the confrontation with absurdity, freedom, and rebellion that defined their philosophy. Camus, in particular, engaged deeply with the brothers Karamazov, especially Ivan's rebellion against God. Where Dostoevsky sought resolution in faith, Camus sought dignity in the refusal of faith, yet he admitted that Dostoevsky had posed the problem better than anyone. Beyond Europe, his impact grew as well. In Japan, writers of the early 20th century, such as Natsume Soseki and later Yukio Mishima, found in him a reflection of their own struggles with modernity, tradition, and despair. In Latin America, his explorations of oppression, poverty, and inner torment influenced writers like Julio Cortázar and Mario Vargas Llosa. Around the world, his themes, crime, punishment, doubt, redemption, proved universal. What is most striking about his global reception is that every culture seemed to find a different Dostoevsky. To philosophers, he was a psychologist of the soul. To novelists, he was a master of dialogue and polyphony. To theologians, he was a prophet of faith in an age of doubt. To revolutionaries, he was both an enemy and an inspiration. Few writers have been so adaptable to the needs of readers across time and space. By the mid-20th century, Dostoevsky's place in world literature was unshakable. His novels were read not just as Russian texts, but as global works of human inquiry. His reception proved that his vision of the human condition, fractured, restless, yearning, was not bound to one nation or culture. It was, and remains, universal. Although the word existentialism would not be coined until the 20th century, Dostoevsky's work is often read as one of its foundations. His novels wrestle with the same questions that later defined the movement, freedom, despair, rebellion, the absurd, the search for meaning in a world that often seems devoid of it. One of his earliest connections to existential thought lies in Notes from Underground. The underground man is consumed by self-awareness, paralyzed by freedom, and tormented by the possibility that life has no ultimate purpose. He mocks the rationalists of his age, declaring that human beings will always sabotage their own happiness simply to assert their will. This defiance of determinism, this insistence on the irrational capacity of human freedom, became a core theme for existentialists decades later. Søren Kierkegaard, writing before Dostoevsky, explored similar ground in Denmark, wrestling with faith, anxiety, and the leap into belief. While it is uncertain whether Dostoevsky ever read Kierkegaard, their affinities are striking. Both understood that human beings live suspended between despair and the possibility of faith, and that reason alone cannot settle the matter. Existentialist thinkers later linked them as twin precursors, speaking from different corners of Europe but echoing the same questions. Nietzsche was more direct in his admiration. He called Dostoevsky a great teacher of psychology, noting especially how he exposed the darker drives beneath morality. Nietzsche found in him not answers, but a mirror, a writer, unafraid to stare into the abyss of suffering and freedom. The tension between Dostoevsky's final turn toward Christian faith and Nietzsche's rejection of it highlights a central divide in existentialism itself, whether meaning must come from God, or whether it must be created in the absence of God. In the 20th century, Sartre and Camus drew from Dostoevsky in profound ways. Sartre acknowledged that Notes from Underground anticipated his own analysis of bad faith and the anguish of freedom. Camus engaged most deeply with the brothers Karamazov. Ivan's rebellion against God, his refusal to accept a world where innocent children suffer, became a cornerstone of Camus's own philosophy of revolt. Camus admired Dostoevsky for posing the problem with brutal clarity, even if he rejected the solution of faith that Dostoevsky offered. What makes Dostoevsky central to existentialism is not that he endorsed any one position, but that he dramatized the struggle itself. His novels are not treatises, but laboratories of experience. They show individuals crushed by guilt, exultant in freedom, racked by despair, searching for redemption. Every major existentialist theme finds a precursor in his pages: anxiety, alienation, rebellion, the confrontation with absurdity, the temptation of suicide, the leap toward or away from God. This is why existentialists claimed him as one of their own. He was not a philosopher in the academic sense, but he accomplished something philosophers often struggle to do. He made the abstract questions of existence visceral, immediate, unforgettable. He turned them into stories that forced the reader to confront the same dilemmas as his characters. For readers today, this link remains one of the most compelling reasons to study him. Dostoevsky does not tell us what to think. He throws us into the storm of freedom and despair and demands that we find our way out. In that demand lies his kinship with existentialism and his enduring power. Long before psychology became a formal discipline, Dostoevsky was already dissecting the human mind with remarkable precision. His novels read like case studies of obsession, guilt, mania, and compulsion. Modern psychologists and psychiatrists often point out that many of the concepts that shaped their field were foreshadowed in his characters and plots. Freud famously called him a great psychologist, though he was ambivalent about Dostoevsky's personal life. Freud saw in the brothers Karamazov a drama that expressed the Oedipus complex, sons torn between love and hatred for their father, culminating in parricide. But Freud's engagement went further. He admired how Dostoevsky laid bare the workings of oppression, neurosis, and the unconscious, not in theory, but in living characters who feel as real as people outside the page. Take Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment. His crime is not just an act of poverty or ideology, but a window into guilt, rationalization, and breakdown. The oscillation between cold logic and crushing remorse mirrors the tension psychologists later studied between conscious justification and unconscious conflict. Dostoevsky seemed to anticipate the concept of cognitive dissonance, the mind's desperate attempt to hold contradictory beliefs together until it collapses under the strain. Or consider the underground man who embodies pathological self-consciousness. He cannot act because he analyzes every possible action to death. His paralysis resembles what modern psychology calls rumination, the cycle of obsessive thought that traps individuals in inaction and despair. His insistence on asserting free will by acting against his own interests anticipates theories of self-sabotage and resistance. Dostoevsky was also fascinated by extreme mental states. Epilepsy, from which he himself suffered, became central in The Idiot. Prince Myshkin's seizures are described not just medically, but experientially, a sudden rush of euphoria and clarity before collapse. Neurologists later noted the accuracy of these descriptions, with some even citing him as a valuable observer of the condition. Through literature, he gave readers insight into what it feels like to inhabit a mind altered by illness. The psychological realism in his novels extends to addiction as well. Dostoevsky's own gambling compulsion provided material for the gambler. The frantic cycles of hope, loss, shame, and renewed hope depict not just entertainment gone wrong, but the mechanics of addiction itself. Readers today can see in his storylines the same compulsions that psychologists analyze in studies of reinforcement and reward. What sets him apart from later psychology is his refusal to reduce behavior to mechanism. For Dostoevsky, psychological states are always entangled with moral and spiritual dimensions. Guilt is not only repression, it is the soul's cry for reconciliation. Madness is not only pathology, it is often the distorted form of a deeper truth. This dual vision, psychological precision combined with spiritual weight, is what continues to make his work compelling to psychologists, philosophers, and theologians alike. In many ways, Dostoevsky anticipated modern clinical categories while never surrendering to mere classification. He understood that human beings cannot be captured fully by diagnosis. His characters remind us that psychology without soul is incomplete. That reminder may be his greatest contribution to the field, one that keeps his novels alive not just as literature but as explorations of the mind itself. Dostoevsky's political views were as turbulent as his life. He began as a young man influenced by radical circles in St. Petersburg, drawn to utopian socialism and the dream of a just society. His early arrest and near execution in 1849 were the result of his involvement with the Petrashevsky Circle, a group of intellectuals who gathered to discuss banned books and progressive ideas. That brush with death, followed by years of prison and exile, permanently altered his outlook. Before his imprisonment, he had believed in rational progress and human perfectibility. But in Siberia, surrounded by criminals, peasants, and the brutal machinery of the state, he came to doubt that society could be reformed by reason alone. He began to see human nature as darker, more contradictory, less malleable than the radicals claimed. Freedom, he concluded, was inseparable from suffering and sin. The dream of a perfect social order ignored the reality of human weakness. When he returned from exile, he positioned himself as a critic of radical ideologies. He feared the growing influence of materialism and atheism in European thought, and he warned that if Russia adopted these ideas wholesale, it would collapse into nihilism and revolution. He directed particular scorn at what he saw as the shallow optimism of Western liberalism, which promised freedom without moral foundation. For him, true freedom required spiritual depth, a bond between people rooted in faith and responsibility. His novels reflect these political struggles. Demons, sometimes titled The Possessed, portrays a group of young revolutionaries whose pursuit of liberation descends into chaos, murder, and despair. The novel was inspired by real events, including the murder of a student by a radical cell. Dostoevsky used the story to warn that ideological fanaticism could only end in destruction. In The Brothers Karamazov, Ivan's rebellion against God carries political weight as well. Without belief, Ivan argues, all things are permitted. This became for Dostoevsky the ultimate danger of a society built on atheism and irrational egoism. Yet he was not simply a reactionary. His political vision included a critique of authoritarianism, particularly the dehumanizing cruelty of the penal system. He also recognized the dignity of the Russian people, especially the peasants, whom he saw as the carriers of a deep spiritual truth. He imagined Russia's mission as a spiritual one, not merely political, to preserve faith and offer a model of community in contrast to the fragmented, materialistic West. This political stance, often called Slavophilism, was controversial in his time and remains so today. Some view it as prophetic, a recognition that Western modernity carried within it the seeds of nihilism and alienation. Others see it as naive or even dangerous, a romantic nationalism that underestimated the complexity of politics. Whatever the judgment, Dostoevsky's political writings and novels insist on one theme: ideas have consequences. How a society thinks about freedom, morality, and belief will shape its fate. In that sense, Dostoevsky was not merely a novelist, but a political thinker in his own right. He saw literature as a battleground for the soul of Russia, a way to warn against the illusions of utopia while defending the need for faith and moral order. Whether one agrees with his conclusions or not, his political vision remains a striking example of how deeply he believed the human condition could not be separated from questions of power, ideology, and community. Religion was not just a theme in Dostoevsky's writing, it was the core struggle of his life. His faith was not simple, nor was it static. It was shaped by childhood devotion, shattered by doubt, tested in prison, and reconstructed in his later years with a passion that was both desperate and profound. His novels, more than anything else, are arenas where belief and unbelief fight to the death. As a boy, Dostoevsky was raised in a devout Orthodox household. His mother, Maria, introduced him to the Gospels and to the Russian tradition of piety, where Christ was seen less as a judge and more as a suffering companion. But his father, strict and often cruel, made religion feel bound up with fear and discipline. This tension between tender faith and harsh authority would echo throughout his later works. In his 20s, Dostoevsky drifted into the intellectual currents of his age. Rationalism, socialism, and the skepticism of European writers tempted him. He read critics of religion, absorbed the promises of science, and began to question the Christianity of his youth. His arrest in 1849 and the years in Siberian exile changed everything. In prison, surrounded by criminals, stripped of status, and forced to confront human misery at its rawest, he rediscovered faith not as abstract doctrine, but as lived survival. He clung to the image of Christ as the one who shared in human suffering. This rediscovered faith was not without torment. Dostoevsky's novels are filled with characters who rage against God, deny him, or despair of his silence. Ivan Karamazov's rebellion is perhaps the most famous example. He rejects the world not because he doubts God exists, but because he cannot accept a God who allows the suffering of children. Dostoevsky poured his own doubts into Ivan's voice, making the challenge as sharp as possible. But then he offered another perspective through figures like Alyosha, who embody faith not as argument but as love and humility. The Christ of Dostoevsky is not the triumphant ruler but the suffering servant. In The Idiot, Prince Myshkin is a kind of Christ figure, innocent, compassionate, misunderstood, ultimately destroyed by the cruelty of others. In Crime and Punishment, the path of Raskolnikov leads to confession and the possibility of redemption through Christ's mercy. Again and again, Dostoevsky returned to the idea that true healing comes not from reason or politics, but from the spiritual encounter with Christ. Yet he never presented this faith as easy. His novels insist that belief must pass through doubt, suffering, and rebellion. This is what makes his religious vision so powerful. It is not a call to blind obedience, but an acknowledgement of how hard it is to believe in a world scarred by violence and injustice. Faith, for Dostoevsky, is not certainty. It is a wager made in darkness, a leap into trust after staring into despair. In his later years, he grew convinced that Russia had a special role to play in preserving Christianity. He saw the West as drifting into atheism and materialism, while the Russian people, with their deep orthodoxy, could offer a vision of unity and humility rooted in faith. Whether this vision was realistic or not, it reveals how deeply he tied religion not only to personal salvation, but to national destiny. For modern readers, Dostoevsky's religious struggle remains compelling precisely because it is never settled. He does not offer neat answers, but dramatizes the agonizing weight of belief and unbelief. He forces us to sit with Ivan's rebellion, with Raskolnikov's torment, with Myshkin's failure, and then asks whether we can still choose faith. That choice, in his view, defines the human condition. If religion was the foundation of Dostoevsky's worldview, morality was its testing ground. His novels explore not just the question of whether God exists, but what follows if he does not. Again and again, Dostoevsky returned to the problem of moral responsibility. Can humans live ethically if there is no divine order to bind them? The phrase most associated with him, "Without God, all is permitted," captures the heart of this concern. It appears in the brothers Karamazov, voiced through the rebellious Ivan. For Ivan, the moral law collapses once God is removed. Any prohibition, any sense of obligation, is revealed as arbitrary. If there is no higher judge, then murder, betrayal, cruelty, all are permissible. Dostoevsky did not necessarily mean this as a philosophical proof, but as a psychological insight. He saw in his time, and perhaps in himself, the danger of what happens when belief is stripped away. Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment is the most vivid test case. He convinces himself that he has the right to kill, that morality does not bind extraordinary men like Napoleon. He murders an old pawnbroker to prove his theory. Yet, instead of liberation, he finds himself crushed by guilt. Dostoevsky demonstrates that conscience is not merely a social construct, nor simply fear of punishment. It is deeper, woven into the human soul, impossible to silence. The real punishment for Raskolnikov is not prison, but the torment of his own moral awareness. Dostoevsky's exploration of morality also extends to collective guilt and responsibility. In The Brothers Karamazov, the monk Zosima teaches that each of us is guilty before all and for all. This radical statement turns morality from an individual calculation into a shared burden. It suggests that no one can retreat into isolation, for we are bound together by our responsibility to one another. This vision contrasts sharply with the Western individualism of Dostoevsky's era and continues to resonate in debates about ethics today. His characters often dramatize the collapse of morality when it is grounded only in reason. The underground man, for instance, refuses to be governed by utilitarian logic, which calculates the greatest good for the greatest number. He mocks such systems as dehumanizing. By acting against his own interest, he asserts his freedom, but also reveals the destructiveness of a morality severed from love and responsibility. Dostoevsky shows that reason alone cannot sustain ethics. It must be bound to something larger than self-interest. He was equally fascinated by the role of suffering in morality. For Dostoevsky, suffering is not just an accident of life, but a crucible of moral transformation. Characters who endure suffering, from Raskolnikov's torment to Sonia's poverty and faith, are tested, humbled, and sometimes redeemed. Without suffering, there is no growth. Without guilt, there is no recognition of responsibility. In his view, morality is inseparable from pain. Dostoevsky's moral vision was both hopeful and terrifying. Hopeful because he believed conscience and responsibility point toward redemption. Terrifying because he knew how fragile morality becomes when belief is eroded. His novels refuse to give easy answers. Instead, they confront us with the consequences of our choices and force us to ask, on what foundation does our morality truly rest? Though the term existentialism would only come into use decades after his death, Dostoevsky is often considered one of the movement's fathers. His novels are filled with characters who embody existential dilemmas, the search for meaning, the rebellion against God, the burden of freedom, and the confrontation with absurdity. Where other 19th century writers offered grand systems or rational progress, Dostoevsky gave readers human beings thrown into a world without guarantees, forced to decide what it means to live. The Notes from Underground is perhaps the purest example. The underground man insists on his absolute freedom, a freedom so radical that he will act against his own best interests simply to assert it. He refuses to be reduced to a cog in a rational system, even if that system promises his happiness. In doing so, he embodies the existentialist insistence that human beings cannot be fully captured by reason or science. He is contradictory, irrational, self-destructive, but utterly free. Later thinkers like Sartre and Camus would recognize this defiance as central to their own explorations of human existence. Dostoevsky also anticipated the existentialist theme of the absurd. In The Brothers Karamazov, Ivan challenges the justice of the universe by cataloging the horrors inflicted on innocent children. His rebellion is not against the existence of God, but against the meaning of suffering. If the price of harmony is the suffering of one child, Ivan says, he rejects the world. This protest, so uncompromising and bleak, mirrors Camus' confrontation with the absurd, the recognition that human longing for justice collides with a world of senseless pain. Freedom, for Dostoevsky, was both a gift and a curse. His characters wrestle with the terror of choice. In Demons, radicals seek to abolish freedom by imposing an ideological system, believing that humans cannot handle the burden of deciding for themselves. In contrast, the Grand Inquisitor in The Brothers Karamazov argues that Christ himself was wrong to offer freedom, because people crave security more than liberty. Here, Dostoevsky presents one of the most haunting existential questions. Do we truly want freedom, or do we prefer the comfort of chains? Unlike later existentialists, Dostoevsky did not embrace a purely secular resolution. For him, the confrontation with freedom, absurdity, and despair led not to nihilism, but to faith. He believed that only through Christ could the contradictions of existence be reconciled. Yet, his willingness to stage the fiercest arguments against faith, to let characters like Ivan speak with devastating clarity, is what makes his work resonate even with secular readers. He dramatized the existential crisis without flinching, and his answers, though rooted in orthodoxy, remain powerful precisely because they are born of struggle, not complacency. His influence on existentialism is undeniable. Nietzsche admired him, calling him the only psychologist from whom he had anything to learn. Sartre and Camus drew on his portraits of freedom and rebellion. Even Kafka's sense of alienation carries echoes of Dostoevsky's underground man. Through them, his explorations of despair and meaninglessness shaped the modern understanding of what it means to exist. In the end, Dostoevsky stands at a crossroads. He is not a systematic philosopher, but his novels force readers into the same position as his characters, to confront despair, absurdity, freedom, and faith without guarantees. This is existentialism in its rawest form, not a doctrine, but a lived confrontation with the terrifying freedom of being human. Long before psychology became a formal science, Dostoevsky was dissecting the human mind with surgical precision. His novels do not simply describe behavior. They open the doors to inner turmoil, split motives, and the contradictions that drive people to act against themselves. In this sense, he was less a novelist than a psychological investigator, mapping out the dark terrain that Freud, Jung, and later thinkers would claim as their own. Raskolnikov is perhaps the clearest example. He constructs a theory that extraordinary men have the right to step beyond morality, but once he acts on it, he collapses under guilt. What Dostoevsky reveals here is the gap between abstract reasoning and lived experience. The mind can rationalize anything, but conscience has a way of breaking through, overwhelming logic with unbearable weight. Modern psychology would later recognize this tension as the conflict between rationalization and unconscious guilt. The underground man, too, anticipates entire schools of psychological thought. He resists the idea that human beings act purely out of rational self-interest. He sabotages his own happiness to prove his freedom. What looks like madness is, in fact, a brutal exposure of the irrational drives that live beneath conscious thought. Freud would later call this the death drive, the compulsion to act against one's own survival. Dostoevsky had dramatized it decades earlier. In The Brothers, Karamazov, the split between the brothers functions almost like a case study in the divisions of the psyche. Ivan represents reason and rebellion, Alyosha embodies faith and compassion, and Dmitri embodies passion and impulse. Together they form a portrait of the fractured human soul, torn between intellect, spirit, and desire. The trial at the novel's end is not simply a legal proceeding, but a psychological drama in which projection, repression, and denial all play roles. Dostoevsky also grasped the importance of the unconscious long before the term was coined. His characters often act on hidden motives, discovering only afterward why they behaved as they did. In Demons, Stavrogin's actions reveal layers of shame and compulsion he cannot articulate. In The Idiot, Prince Myshkin's purity exposes the neuroses of those around him, bringing hidden darkness to the surface. His fiction anticipates the later recognition that much of human behavior is governed by forces outside conscious awareness. Equally striking is his understanding of compulsion and addiction. Dostoevsky himself suffered from gambling addiction, and he poured that obsession into characters who cannot stop even as they destroy themselves. His portraits of addiction are not moralistic, but deeply psychological: the thrill, the despair, the cycle of guilt and return. This, too, would later become central to psychological study, but in Dostoevsky it appears already in vivid human form. For Dostoevsky, psychology was not an end in itself, but a way of understanding the moral and spiritual condition of humanity. He did not separate the psyche from questions of conscience, guilt, and redemption. In fact, he resisted the reduction of human behavior to mere mechanisms. His exploration of psychology always pointed beyond itself, toward the mystery of freedom and the possibility of grace. Modern psychology still finds him relevant. Freud acknowledged him as a great analyst of the unconscious. Jung admired his exploration of archetypal themes. Even contemporary psychoanalysts turned to Dostoevsky to understand the tangled relationship between guilt, freedom, and suffering. Few writers have penetrated the mind as deeply, or left so lasting a mark on how we think about what it means to be human. Dostoevsky's politics were never static. They shifted as dramatically as his life, from youthful radicalism to conservative nationalism, from flirtations with socialism to defenses of orthodoxy and autocracy. This makes him a challenging figure to categorize, but also one of the most revealing voices of 19th century Russia. His political journey reflects both his personal struggles and the broader tensions of his age. As a young man in St. Petersburg, Dostoevsky was drawn to intellectual circles that questioned the Tsarist order. The Petrushevsky group, with whom he was arrested, discussed utopian socialism and the liberation of the serfs. Dostoevsky read writers like Fourier and George Sand, and he admired the possibility of a society built on equality and justice. His early works, including Poor Folk, display compassion for the downtrodden and outrage at social injustice. But prison and exile changed him. In Siberia, he lived among criminals, soldiers, and peasants. He saw firsthand the resilience of ordinary Russians and the strength they drew from orthodoxy. While intellectuals in St. Petersburg debated theories, the convicts beside him clung to faith, ritual, and the Tsar as their anchors. This experience convinced Dostoevsky that the Western socialist ideals he once embraced ignored the soul of the Russian people. When he returned from exile, he was a different man politically. He still opposed oppression and cruelty, but he distrusted abstract political systems. He became skeptical of Western liberalism, seeing it as too materialistic and detached from spiritual life. Instead, he turned toward a vision of Russia rooted in orthodoxy, communal values, and loyalty to the nation. His journalistic writings fiercely attacked European rationalism and defended the unique destiny of Russia. In novels like Demons, Dostoevsky portrayed radical revolutionaries as destructive forces. The characters who try to remake society through ideology end up spreading chaos and violence. He believed that when humans attempt to build a perfect society without God, they unleash destruction instead. In this sense, his politics became a warning against utopian projects, anticipating the tragic experiments of the 20th century. Yet his politics were not simply reactionary. He remained deeply concerned with the plight of the poor and the moral corruption of the elite. He criticized serfdom, greed, and the exploitation of the weak. His conservatism was not indifference, but an insistence that social reform must be rooted in spiritual renewal, not imported ideologies. For him, true progress meant a return to faith and moral responsibility, not a leap into Western rationalism. Dostoevsky's nationalism was equally complex. He loved Russia and believed it had a unique mission in history. He often contrasted Russian humility and faith with what he saw as Western arrogance and materialism. At times, his writings veered into chauvinism, even expressing hostility toward neighboring nations. But at its core, his nationalism was tied to his belief that Russia's suffering and resilience gave it a universal role in reconciling humanity with God. Today, Dostoevsky's politics remain controversial. Some see him as a prophet who warned of the dangers of nihilism and ideology. Others criticize his embrace of orthodoxy and autocracy as reactionary. But what is clear is that he refused to reduce politics to economics or power alone. For him, politics was inseparable from the deepest questions of morality, faith, and the human soul. Faith was not a quiet background element in Dostoevsky's life, it was the crucible in which his ideas were tested. Raised in the Russian Orthodox tradition, he drifted into doubt in his youth, attracted to rationalism and Western philosophy. Yet the trauma of his mock execution and the long years in Siberian exile turned him back toward belief. For Dostoevsky, faith was not inherited but fought for, something won in the face of despair. In prison, he observed the peasants and convicts around him. Many had committed brutal crimes, yet they clung to rituals, icons, and prayers. Their faith was not theoretical but lived, a lifeline in unbearable conditions. Dostoevsky came to admire this resilience. He saw that intellectual skepticism could strip away illusions, but it could not sustain the soul. The simple faith of the peasant offered something rationalism could not, a sense of meaning in suffering. This experience transformed his writing. Dostoevsky no longer framed questions of morality and psychology apart from faith. Instead, he placed them within a spiritual drama, humanity caught between rebellion and redemption. His novels became arenas where belief and unbelief clashed, often in the same character. He gave the strongest voices to skeptics like Ivan Karamazov, whose rebellion against God is one of the most devastating in literature. Yet he also offered counterpoints, figures like Alyosha or Prince Myshkin, who embody the possibility of grace. Dostoevsky's religious vision was not naive. He knew the appeal of atheism. He had lived in doubt himself. That is why his defense of faith carries weight. It is not the easy confidence of someone sheltered from skepticism, but the hard-won conviction of one who has passed through it. His God is not the God of comfort, but the God found in the depths of suffering. In the brothers Karamazov, the parable of the Grand Inquisitor crystallizes this tension. Ivan imagines Christ returning to Earth, only to be arrested by the Church. The Inquisitor accuses him of burdening humanity with freedom, when what people really want is bread and security. This passage dramatizes Dostoevsky's most haunting question: can faith survive freedom, or do people prefer to surrender it for comfort? Even in defending faith, he refused to dismiss its most powerful critiques. For Dostoevsky, Christ was at the center of everything. He once wrote that if anyone proved to him that Christ was outside the truth, he would still choose Christ over truth. This startling statement reveals the depth of his conviction. Faith, for him, was not a set of propositions, but a commitment of the whole self. It was not about escaping suffering, but enduring it with meaning. His orthodoxy was tied to his vision of Russia's destiny. He believed the Russian people, through their suffering and humility, carried a spiritual mission. While Western Europe pursued progress and reason, Russia would preserve faith. This conviction, though bound up in nationalism, gave his religious thought both a universal and a distinctly Russian character. In the end, Dostoevsky's faith is inseparable from his exploration of despair. His novels do not offer easy consolations. Instead, they push readers to the brink of nihilism and then point, however faintly, toward redemption. Faith, in his vision, is not the absence of doubt, but the courage to believe through it. For Dostoevsky, morality was never abstract. It was lived, messy, and costly. A battlefield where individuals wrestled with conscience, temptation, and freedom. His novels do not preach virtue from a distance. They immerse readers in the torment of characters who try to justify, evade, or transcend morality, only to collide with the weight of guilt. Raskolnikov, in Crime and Punishment, frames morality as a question of exceptionalism. He convinces himself that some individuals, great men, lawgivers, creators, have the right to step beyond common morality if it allows them to achieve higher goals. In theory, this makes sense to him. He invokes figures like Napoleon as examples. But once he murders the pawnbroker, theory disintegrates under the reality of guilt. Dostoevsky makes clear that morality cannot be escaped through intellectual arguments. Conscience is not a theory but a visceral force, inescapable once it has been violated. Ivan Karamazov provides another path into Dostoevsky's moral vision. Ivan is consumed by the problem of evil, insisting that no future harmony can justify the suffering of innocent children. His rebellion is moral at its core, a refusal to accept a universe that allows such injustice. Yet Ivan himself unravels when he realizes that his intellectual rebellion has consequences in the world. His rejection of God is not simply theoretical, it clears space for his father's murder, whether or not he committed it himself. Dostoevsky thus shows that morality is not isolated to thought. Ideas shape lives, and rejecting responsibility does not absolve one from its weight. Morality in Dostoevsky is deeply tied to freedom. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he did not see morality as a set of external rules. Instead, it was bound up with the freedom to choose, and the terrifying consequences of those choices. Humans are free, and that freedom includes the possibility of destruction. His characters often test this freedom to its limits, trying to see if they can live without conscience or accountability. What emerges is the recognition that freedom without responsibility collapses into chaos. Dostoevsky also understood morality as inseparable from suffering. In his vision, moral awareness often awakens through pain. The guilty suffer until they confess. The proud are humbled by humiliation. The despairing discover compassion in their brokenness. For him, morality was not about following rules, but about transformation, a process that always involved trial, collapse, and the chance of renewal. At the same time, Dostoevsky resisted the idea of morality as purely social or utilitarian. He saw it as grounded in the mystery of the human soul and ultimately in the presence of God. Without God, he argued, morality loses its anchor and becomes a matter of calculation or convenience. This conviction runs through his novels, where characters who try to construct morality without transcendence eventually face collapse. Yet he never allowed this vision to become simplistic. He gave full voice to the most devastating critiques of morality. The underground man mocking virtue, Ivan rejecting divine justice, revolutionary scorning tradition. By allowing these voices to speak powerfully, he forced readers to confront the fragility of morality and the difficulty of upholding it. In doing so, he made his affirmations of conscience and faith more compelling, because they emerged not from dogma, but from struggle. Dostoevsky's moral vision remains unsettling. He does not let readers rest in complacency. He exposes the cracks in rational justifications, the illusions of self-righteousness, the ease with which freedom becomes destruction. But he also insists that morality is real, that conscience is ineradicable, and that redemption, however faint, is possible. Though the word existentialism would not be coined until decades after his death, Dostoevsky stands as one of its great forerunners. His novels teem with questions that later defined the movement. What does it mean to be free? Can life have meaning without God? How do we endure the absurdity of suffering? To read him is to see the seeds of Camus, Sartre, and Kierkegaard taking root in Russian soil. At the heart of Dostoevsky's existential vision is freedom. Unlike thinkers who saw freedom as the ability to act without restraint, Dostoevsky understood it as both gift and burden. Humans are free to believe or rebel, to create or destroy. This radical freedom is exhilarating, but it is also terrifying. Characters like Raskolnikov test the boundaries of freedom by attempting to step beyond morality. Others, like the underground man, revel in using freedom to undermine themselves, choosing against their own interest simply to prove they can. Freedom, in Dostoevsky's world, is inseparable from responsibility and self-destruction. His works also explore the problem of absurdity, long before Camus made it central to existentialist thought. Ivan Karamazov embodies this tension. He insists that the suffering of the innocent makes the universe irrational, even unbearable. If there is no justice, no final harmony, then life is absurd. Dostoevsky does not dismiss this argument, he gives it full force. Yet he also suggests that in the face of absurdity, one can still choose faith, love, or sacrifice. The absurd becomes not a wall, but a crucible in which belief and rebellion collide. Another existential theme running through Dostoevsky is the search for authenticity. His characters are constantly torn between roles imposed by society and the raw reality of their inner selves. The underground man mocks rational progress because he feels it reduces human beings to predictable machines. He insists that people will sabotage themselves rather than be trapped in such a system. In this way, Dostoevsky anticipates Sartre's insistence on authenticity and the refusal to live in bad faith. Yet Dostoevsky differs from later existentialists in crucial ways. For Sartre, existence precedes essence. For Dostoevsky, essence is found in God, and existence is the struggle to align with or rebel against it. For Camus, the absurd leads to defiance without transcendence. For Dostoevsky, it points toward Christ. In this sense, his existentialism is theistic, rooted in orthodoxy, and inseparable from the idea of redemption. The existentialists who followed him recognized this tension. Nietzsche admired his psychological depth, but rejected his religious conclusions. Camus praised his honesty about suffering, but saw faith as a leap he could not take. Sartre drew on his portraits of freedom and despair, but stripped them of theological grounding. In all these cases, Dostoevsky served as both inspiration and opponent, a writer whose exploration of freedom, despair, and authenticity could not be ignored. For modern readers, this existential dimension of Dostoevsky remains one of his most compelling legacies. He does not offer solutions neatly packaged. Instead, he plunges readers into the chaos of freedom, the torment of doubt, and the fragile hope of redemption. His existentialism is not a philosophy to be summarized, but an experience to be endured. In this way, he continues to shape not just thinkers but anyone who dares to ask what it means to live. Long before Freud, Jung, or modern psychology, Dostoevsky was already dissecting the hidden forces of the human mind. His novels read like case studies of obsession, guilt, repression, and the divided self. He did not write treatises. Instead, he dramatized the psyche by throwing his characters into crises where inner conflicts could no longer be ignored. In doing so, he became one of the earliest explorers of psychological depth in literature. Raskolnikov is a prime example. His theory of extraordinary men is not merely a philosophical position. It is a mask covering insecurity, pride, and a desperate need to justify himself. After murdering the pawnbroker, he does not face immediate capture. Instead, he collapses under the psychological torment of guilt. He suffers fevers, paranoia, and the creeping sense that he cannot escape his own conscience. Dostoevsky shows that punishment begins not in the courtroom but in the mind. Similarly, the underground man embodies psychological fragmentation. He is intelligent yet self-destructive, craving recognition while simultaneously despising himself. He sabotages his own happiness, lashing out at others and then wallowing in shame. This character reveals Dostoevsky's grasp of what we now call masochism, self-sabotage, and the paradoxes of the will. Modern psychology would later give names to these phenomena, but Dostoevsky had already mapped them with uncanny precision. His work also explores repression and the unconscious. In The Brothers, Karamazov, Ivan's intellectual rebellion is rational and articulate, but beneath it festers an unacknowledged desire for his father's death. When that death occurs, Ivan descends into delirium, haunted by hallucinations of the devil. Dostoevsky portrays how suppressed impulses can resurface in distorted, destructive forms, an insight that anticipates Freud's theories of repression and the return of the repressed. Guilt is another central theme. In Dostoevsky's vision, guilt is not simply the recognition of wrongdoing, but a force that shapes the entire psyche. Characters wrestle with guilt not only for their actions, but for their thoughts, desires, and even their complicity in the suffering of others. This broad, almost cosmic sense of responsibility pushes them toward confession or collapse. His exploration of guilt laid groundwork for existential psychology, where the individual must confront freedom, responsibility, and the inevitability of failure. Dostoevsky also understood the role of irrational drives. He rejected the Enlightenment view of humans as purely rational beings. Instead, he portrayed people as creatures driven by contradiction, craving love while inflicting cruelty, desiring freedom yet begging for authority, pursuing happiness only to sabotage it. The underground man ridicules rational self-interest, insisting that people will choose pain or destruction simply to assert their freedom. This anticipation of irrational motivation would later be central to psychoanalysis and behavioral psychology alike. What makes Dostoevsky's psychology so compelling is that it is inseparable from lived experience. His insights came not from laboratory studies, but from suffering, prison, illness, and constant observation of people under pressure. His characters feel real because they are drawn from real psychological crises he had seen and endured himself. Modern psychology owes much to this literary groundwork. Freud openly acknowledged Dostoevsky's importance, calling The Brothers Karamazov the most powerful novel ever written. Jung, too, admired his exploration of archetypes and the shadow side of the psyche. Even today, psychiatrists and therapists turn to his works not as manuals, but as mirrors of the human condition. In Dostoevsky's novels, psychology is never detached from morality or faith. The mind is not a closed system, but a battleground of conscience, freedom, and belief. His exploration of the psyche always points beyond itself, to the larger question of what it means to be human. Politics was never peripheral in Dostoevsky's life or work. From his early years as a young radical in St. Petersburg to his later critiques of revolutionary movements, he was entangled in the storms of Russian society. His experiences of arrest, mock execution, and exile were not abstract encounters with ideology. They were scars that reshaped his vision of power, authority, and rebellion. In his youth, Dostoevsky was drawn to progressive circles. He attended meetings of the Petrushevsky Group, a circle of intellectuals who discussed banned books and criticized autocracy. Their ideas leaned towards socialism, utopian reform, and the possibility of reshaping society through reason. For a young writer still forming his worldview, these gatherings were intoxicating. But when the group was arrested, Dostoevsky learned that politics in Russia was not just theory. The state responded with brutal force, staging a mock execution before sending him to Siberia. That trauma left him with an indelible sense of how fragile freedom could be. After his release, Dostoevsky's political vision shifted. He grew deeply suspicious of utopian schemes and revolutionary promises. He saw in them not liberation, but danger, the temptation to reduce human beings to abstract units in pursuit of an ideal society. In novels like Demons, he depicted the chaos and nihilism that he believed revolutionary movements could unleash. The conspirators in that novel are not noble reformers but fractured, fanatical figures, willing to destroy everything in the name of a dream. Through them, Dostoevsky dramatized his fear that political idealism divorced from morality and faith could descend into terror. At the same time, Dostoevsky was not a blind defender of autocracy. He criticized corruption, cruelty, and the failures of Russian authority. His writings often exposed the suffering inflicted by poverty, injustice, and arbitrary power. But unlike the revolutionaries, he did not believe salvation lay in overthrowing the system through violence. Instead, he emphasized the transformation of individuals, conscience, compassion, and faith as the true foundations for renewal. His political thought is marked by paradox. On one hand, he distrusted Western liberalism and socialism, seeing them as rooted in rationalism and materialism that ignored the soul. On the other, he was wary of blind nationalism or state power unchecked by conscience. He advocated for a uniquely Russian path, rooted in orthodoxy and communal values, but he did so while exploring the contradictions and dangers of that vision. Dostoevsky's political writings also reflect his belief in the psychological roots of ideology. For him, politics was never just about structures or policies. It was about the human heart. He portrayed revolutionaries as driven as much by pride, resentment, or despair as by principles. In this way, his political analysis was inseparable from his psychology. Ideas are lived not in manifestos, but in the souls of individuals who carry them. Today, Dostoevsky's politics remain controversial. Some see him as a prophet warning against the nihilism of totalitarianism. Others view him as reactionary, clinging to faith and tradition in the face of necessary reform. Both readings capture part of the truth. His politics resist easy classification because they are not systematic doctrines, but the product of a mind wrestling with freedom, suffering, and the fate of society. In the end, Dostoevsky's politics reflect his larger vision that no system, however rational or just it may seem, can save humanity if it ignores the depths of the human soul. For him, the real revolution must always begin within. In his final years, Dostoevsky was both a man marked by illness and a writer at the height of his power. Epileptic seizures plagued him more frequently, leaving him weak and exhausted. Financial pressures never fully vanished, and his health was fragile. Yet his mind burned brighter than ever, and his reputation grew steadily in Russia and abroad. He had endured poverty, prison, exile, and scandal, but by the end of his life, he stood as one of Russia's greatest voices. In 1879, he published The Brothers Karamazov, his last and perhaps greatest novel. It was a culmination of his life's themes: freedom and faith, guilt and redemption, rebellion and grace. Through the three brothers, Ivan the Skeptic, Dmitri the Passionate, and Alyosha the Faithful, he staged the ultimate confrontation between belief and doubt. The novel offered no easy answers. Instead, it gave readers the raw struggle of human existence, the agonies of conscience, and glimpses of redemption in acts of compassion and love. It remains one of the towering achievements of world literature. By this time, Dostoevsky had achieved recognition not just as a novelist, but as a cultural figure. He was invited to speak at the unveiling of a monument to Pushkin in Moscow, where his speech electrified the audience. He praised Pushkin as the embodiment of the Russian spirit, while also calling for unity, compassion, and faith. The speech was received as prophetic, cementing his role as a moral voice for his country. Despite this acclaim, Dostoevsky's health continued to decline. In early 1881, he suffered a fatal hemorrhage in his lungs. He was only 59 years old. His death shocked Russia. Thousands attended his funeral, filling the streets of St. Petersburg. Students, workers, aristocrats, and clergy all gathered to honor the man who had chronicled their struggles and hopes with such relentless honesty. His legacy grew quickly. Writers across Europe recognized his genius. Nietzsche called him the only psychologist from whom I had anything to learn. Freud described The Brothers Karamazov as the greatest novel ever written. Kafka, Camus, Sartre, and countless others drew inspiration from his psychological and philosophical explorations. Dostoevsky had given voice to the darkest recesses of human consciousness, and modern literature would never be the same. In Russia, his influence was equally profound. Tolstoy admired his psychological insight, even if they disagreed on faith and politics. Later generations would grapple with his religious vision, his warnings against nihilism, and his unflinching depiction of suffering. Soviet critics wrestled with his contradictions, alternately condemning and praising him. Yet his works endured, passed from hand to hand, because they spoke to something deeper than ideology. Today, Dostoevsky remains one of the most widely read and studied writers in the world. His novels are not relics of a past age, but living texts that continue to challenge readers. They confront us with freedom and responsibility, with guilt and grace, with despair and hope. They remind us that beneath every political system, every philosophy, every dream of progress, lies the human soul, fragile, free, and searching for meaning. In the end, Dostoevsky's life and work stand as a single testimony, that to be human is to wrestle with darkness, to confront suffering, and to search, however falteringly, for redemption. He did not offer solutions so much as he revealed the depth of the questions. That is why he endures, not as a preacher of certainty, but as a witness to the mystery of human existence.